Let me take you back to Berlin in 1933. The world is still nursing its wounds from the Great War. But in the heart of Germany, a man rises with fire in his nature, fear in his voice, and hatred in his heart. His speeches ignite the crowd, loud, furious, dangerous, but full of patriotism. Yes, we are talking about none other than Adolf Hitler, one of the most infamous figures in human history, who has become a lasting symbol of hatred, genocide, and the horrors of the Holocaust. But the question remains, how on earth does a person become this ruthless, so warlike, so cold-hearted, that he ends up orchestrating the murder of over 6 million innocent people, especially Jews? Let's take a plunge into this dark enigma and explore it from a perspective that few rebels or historians have ever truly uncovered before. To understand Hitler's hatred, it's not enough to label him as mad. His story is tangled with the fears, prejudices, and broken dreams of Europe. It began long before him, in an old continent still scarred by war and desperate for answers. For centuries, Jews had been blamed for everything that went wrong. They were called greedy, accused of manipulating money, and branded as people cursed by God. In almost every part of Europe, special laws controlled where they could live and what they could do. But then came the French Revolution, and with it, new ideas about equality and freedom. By the early 1800s, the world began to change for European Jews. Prussia granted them equal rights in 1812. Austria-Hungary followed in 1867. For the first time, Jews could step out of the ghettos and live like everyone else, free citizens in a modern world. They took that chance with passion. Jewish families worked hard, studied hard, and climbed the ladder of society. They became bankers, scientists, journalists, and artists. They were part of the new capitalism, the face of progress. Many prospered, and a few even became incredibly rich. And that success didn't go unnoticed. The old middle class, small shop owners, clerks, and civil servants watched as the world around them changed. Industrialization brought massive factories, machines, and workers who replaced old trades. The world they knew was slipping away, and they couldn't keep up. Then came the great economic crash of 1873. Germany was hit hard. The stock market collapsed, fortunes vanished, and unemployment soared. And as always happens in times of chaos, people wanted someone to blame. The Jews, visible, successful, and different, became the perfect target. They were accused of representing modern capitalism itself, the system many blamed for their misery. Anti-liberal conservatives, struggling workers, and angry nationalists all pointed fingers in the same direction. And from this resentment, something new was born: modern anti-Semitism. It wasn't just the old religious hatred anymore. It wasn't about faith or belief. This new wave of hate claimed that Jews were different, not because of their religion, but because of their blood. This is where things turned dark. By the late 19th century, the idea of race had become fashionable in Europe. Scientists and philosophers began dividing humanity into categories: white, black, Asian, and countless others. They claimed the white race was superior, the natural ruler of the world. Others, they said, were lesser, almost subhuman. It was all nonsense dressed up as science, but it spread like wildfire. Theories mixed biology with arrogance, and soon people began to believe that behavior, intelligence, and morality came from blood. One French writer, Count Joseph Arthur de Gobineau, argued that races determined the fate of civilizations, that pure white blood produced greatness, while mixed blood caused decline. His ideas became the foundation for a new kind of racism, one that claimed to be scientific. Then came Charles Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859. Darwin's theory explained how plants and animals evolved through natural selection. survival of the fittest. But racists twisted his ideas. They turned biology into ideology. They said human races were also locked in a struggle for survival. Strong versus weak, pure versus mixed. To them, Jews weren't just a religion anymore. They were an inferior race. Writers like Eugen Dühring and Theodor Fritsch began publishing books that glorified the noble Aryan and demonized the Jew as the source of corruption, greed, and decay. They claimed that Jewish behavior came from blood, fixed, unchangeable, and evil by nature. These ideas spread through Germany like poison, and young Adolf Hitler was there to absorb it all. From 1908 to 1913, he lived in Vienna, a city filled with art, poverty, and powerful nationalist movements. Vienna was also deeply anti-Semitic. Pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches constantly attacked Jews. Politicians like Karl Lueger, the city's mayor, gained massive popularity by turning hatred into a political strategy. Hitler studied it all. He admired men like Lueger and the priest-scholar Georg von Schonerer, both famous for their racist and nationalist views. In Mein Kampf, Hitler later criticized Lueger for not going far enough, calling his approach false anti-Semitism because it wasn't fully racial. That small detail says everything. By that time, Hitler didn't see Jews as people who could change. He saw them as biologically doomed, enemies by nature. On August 13, 1920, Hitler gave a speech that summed up his entire belief system. He said, "The character of the Jew is in his blood and must act accordingly. No matter what profession he has, he is and will remain a Jew." For him, it didn't matter what a Jewish person did, said, or believed. Their blood, he claimed, determined their destiny. And in that twisted belief, he found his life's mission. But the roots of his hatred were not born in isolation. They were planted by centuries of prejudice, watered by envy and fear, and shaped by a false sense of science that turned racism into reason. By the time Hitler rose to power, those ideas were already deeply embedded in European culture. He didn't invent anti-Semitism, he weaponized it. He took the myths of the past, the pain of the defeated, and the lies of the so-called scientists, and turned them into an ideology that would soon set the world on fire. They say no one is born a monster, and that holds true for Hitler as well. Before he turned into the most feared man of his time, Adolf Hitler was just a boy, but not a child in cool circumstances. He was fragile, lonely, and trapped inside a broken home. Hitler was born in 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small town in Austria. He was the fourth of 6 children of Alois Hitler and Clara Pölzl. His father, Alois, was a strict government worker, proud, short-tempered, and violent. His word was law inside the house, and when his children disobeyed, his punishments were brutal. But interestingly, Clara, Hitler's mother, was the complete opposite: gentle, affectionate, and overprotective. She adored her son, and he adored her back, but her constant care came with emotional control. She shielded him from the world, yet that love created something unhealthy, a deep dependency that would follow him all his life. The result was a childhood filled with confusion. One parent ruled with fear, the other smothered with love. For young Adolf, this tension planted early seeds of insecurity and resentment. He learned to hide his emotions and to never appear weak. Alois wanted his son to follow in his footsteps and become a civil servant. But Adolf dreamed of something else. Well, he loved art. He spent hours sketching buildings, faces, and landscapes. His drawings were the only place where he felt free. But every time he talked about becoming an artist, his father mocked him, calling his dream foolish and useless. the two clashed constantly, and when Alois died in 1903, Hitler was only 14. He felt both grief and a strange sense of relief, as if the tyrant who had ruled his world was finally gone. But that peace didn't last long. In 1907, Adolf applied to the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts. He was confident he'd be accepted, but the school rejected him. His drawings, they said, lacked creativity. For most people, rejection is painful. For Hitler, it was devastating. It shattered the only dream he truly had. He didn't see it as a failure of skill. He saw it as proof that the system was unfair, corrupt, and rigged against him. That was the first time his mind began creating conspiracy stories, the belief that shadowy forces were always working to destroy him. Soon after, his mother, Clara, died of breast cancer. Her death broke him completely. He was 18, alone, and lost in the world. What little warmth he had left disappeared with her. So, the next few years were grim. He drifted through Vienna, surviving in cheap hostels and homeless shelters. He sold postcards, ate in soup kitchens, and watched the city from the shadows. Vienna at that time was a city bursting with culture, but it was also boiling with anger, nationalism, and anti-Semitism. And Hitler soaked it all in. He read pamphlets filled with racist propaganda and attended political speeches that blamed Jews and foreigners for society's problems. These ideas gave him something he hadn't felt in years. Yeah, the sense of belonging. In a world that had rejected him, hate gave him identity. By 1914, when World War I erupted, Hitler saw his chance to reinvent himself. He joined the German army. For the first time, he wore a uniform that gave him purpose and structure. The chaos of war made sense to him in a way life never had. But when Germany lost in 1918, everything fell apart again. Hitler was furious. He couldn't accept defeat. He refused to believe that the German army had truly lost. Instead, he believed it had been stabbed in the back by Jews, communists, and traitors at home. That lie became the foundation of his obsession. After the war, Germany was in ruins, poor, hungry, and humiliated. And in that chaos, Hitler found his stage. He joined a small group called the German Workers' Party. His speeches were fiery, emotional, and full of anger. People listened. They were desperate for hope, and he gave them someone to blame. From those early speeches came the building blocks of his ideology: racial purity, nationalism, and above all, hatred of Jews. But beneath those political ideas lay something deeply personal: his obsession with control, his hatred of weakness, and his refusal to ever feel powerless again. All of it traced back to his childhood. Psychologists later studied Hitler's behavior and found clear signs of what today would be recognized as serious psychological disorders. The most obvious was narcissism, an extreme need for admiration and power, combined with a deep fear of rejection. Every time he failed, like his rejection from the Art Academy, he built stories to protect his ego. It was never his fault. Someone else was always to blame. He also showed strong paranoid traits, constantly convinced that enemies were conspiring against him. To him, the world was divided into two camps: the pure and the corrupt, the loyal and the traitorous. There was no middle ground. Historians also describe him as having borderline personality traits, emotional instability, explosive anger, and an all-or-nothing mindset. His speeches weren't just political. They were emotional outbursts that swung from rage to tears, filled with manipulation and intensity. Then there was his messianic delusion, the belief that he was chosen by destiny to save Germany. He truly believed he was on a divine mission. That illusion justified everything: every war, every crime, every death. In his mind, he wasn't destroying. He was cleansing, purifying, restoring greatness. But perhaps the most chilling trait was his lack of empathy. Hitler could watch cities burn, millions die, and feel nothing. He didn't see human beings, only tools for his vision. That coldness made genocide possible. Psychologists often call this functional psychopathy, the ability to manipulate, command, and destroy without remorse. All these traits, narcissism, paranoia, delusion, and lack of empathy, fed each other, turning him into a psychological storm. But none of it happened overnight. It was built layer by layer, by pain, humiliation, rejection, and the refusal to confront his own weaknesses. The boy who couldn't handle failure became the man who destroyed nations to prove his worth. When Hitler came to power in 1933, those inner demons finally took shape in the real world. His childhood pain became a policy. His fear of weakness turned into brutal control. His hunger for admiration became a cult of personality. His emotional wounds transformed into national trauma. The speeches that once echoed in beer halls now filled stadiums. The rage of a broken child became the fury of a nation, and the world would pay the price for the pain that one man never resolved. Hitler's story reminds us that evil isn't born in a single moment. It grows quietly, in abuse, in loneliness, in unhealed wounds. The dictator who brought the world to its knees was, once, a frightened boy searching for identity in all the wrong places. The wound of love, breaking his psyche. The explanation of how Hitler became a monster doesn't just end with decoding his childhood traumas and the world around him as he was growing into a young adult. There is one important but overlooked layer to it: his tragic failure in love life. Before the dictator, before the war, there was just a kid from Austria whose heart broke in silence. And maybe that heartbreak left a scar that never healed. Let's rewind the story. Linz, Austria, early 1900s. A teenage Hitler walked home from school, sketchbook under his arm, head full of dreams. He wasn't the future Führer yet. He was just a shy boy, obsessed with art, music, and fantasy. And then he saw her. Her name was Stefanie Isaak. She was young, graceful, confident, everything he wished he was. Every day she passed his street, and every day he froze. He never said hi, never smiled, never even dared to wave. But in his mind, he built a whole life with her. He imagined marrying her, moving to Vienna, and becoming a famous artist. He even wrote letters to her that he never sent. But reality didn't care about his dreams. Stefanie got engaged to another man, and just like that, the world inside his head collapsed. To most people, that would have been a small heartbreak, a teenage crush fading away. But to Hitler, it felt like the universe rejected him. That pain didn't make him softer, it made him colder. And the strangest twist to the story was her surname, Isaak. It sounded Jewish. Historians still argue whether she really was, but for him, that name could have meant everything. The girl he adored, the girl who never looked back at him, carried a name that belonged to the very group that was hated by probably most of Europe. Maybe it planted a tiny seed of resentment, a mix of love, rejection, and bitterness that would one day grow into something terrifying. But after this failure as a teenager, the young man who once waited for Stefanie on a street now walked the dirty alleys of Vienna, listening to angry voices blaming Jews for everything. It was in those years that something inside him shifted. The boy who used to love people from a distance now began to hate them from the same distance. He turned emotion into ideology. But the failure in his love life further wounded his soul, preparing him to become a monster. In the late 1920s, he met Geli Raubal, his half-niece, another bright, charming, and full-of-life girl. For the first time in years, he smiled again. People around him said she was the only person who made him feel human. But that feeling didn't last long. Hitler's idea of love had never been normal. It was always about control. He told Geli what to wear, whom to meet, and when to go out. He treated her not like a lover, but like a possession. She wanted to live, to be free, to breathe, but he wouldn't let her. That tension grew until one day in 1931, Gailey locked herself in a room and shot herself with Hitler's pistol. When Hitler found out, he completely broke down, further distorting his soul and mental peace. But after that, something in him went dark forever. He kept her picture for the rest of his life, in a room untouched, where no one was allowed to enter. But more disasters were going to come in the dictator's life, in the shape of love tragedies. Then came Eva Braun. She met him when she was 17, and at that time, Hitler was famously known for his attraction towards teenage girls. Eva soon realized that loving Hitler was like loving a shadow. He kept her hidden from the world because he wanted to appear single, the leader who belonged only to Germany. Eva spent years waiting for him, stuck inside his secret world. She tried to end her life twice, desperate for his attention. Both times, he barely reacted, but still she managed to stay anyway, loyal, invisible, forgotten. And when the world started falling apart, when bombs were falling on Berlin and his empire was crumbling, that's when he finally married her. In an underground bunker, with the sound of explosions above, less than 2 days later, they both swallowed poison. Now, if you look at Hitler's life like a map of broken hearts, a clear pattern appears. He never really loved anyone. He obsessed, controlled, and consumed. Every time he felt close to someone, he turned it into ownership. Every time he faced loss, he replaced emotion with hate. He never learned how to connect. He only learned how to command. And that brings us back to where it all started, to her teenage crush, Stefanie Isaak. He never spoke to. Historians debate how much of that story is true, but you can't ignore an account of information coming from his childhood friend, August Kubizek. There's a lot in this story that relates to what Hitler did throughout the course of his life. Stefanie might have been the first woman to awaken emotion in him, and also the first to remind him of rejection, difference, and humiliation. Her surname, Isaak, sounded Jewish, and the guy might have developed a derangement for people who belong to the Jewish religion. Each time he got colder, each time more lifeless. The boy who once felt deeply could no longer feel anything. The man who wanted to be loved ended up loving only power, and somewhere deep in that chain of broken feelings still stood Stefanie Isaak, the first woman who made him feel something, and the first who reminded him that he could be rejected. Her name, the name that sounded Jewish, may have become the root of something terrible. It's almost poetic in a horrifying way. The man who once dreamed about a Jewish girl's smile would grow up to order the deaths of millions who shared her heritage. It wasn't just ideology anymore. It was personal mythology. In his twisted mind, every act of destruction was maybe his way of killing that old pain, that reminder that he once loved and lost. The heart that couldn't be loved learned to find strength in fear. And that's how emotion turned into ideology, and heartbreak turned into hate. Adolf Hitler's story begins long before his rise to power, with his father, Alois Hitler. He was born as the illegitimate son of Anna Schicklgruber in the small village of Strones near Döllersheim in 1837. This region was part of Waldviertel in Lower Austria, a rough and dry agricultural land where most people lived simple, hard-working lives. Since no one knew who his father was, the boy was given his mother's surname and grew up as Alois Schicklgruber. This uncertainty about his ancestry later gave rise to many speculations, especially the theory that Adolf Hitler might have had Jewish blood through his father's line. The rumor became famous when Hans Frank, who later served as Hitler's governor in occupied Poland, brought it up during the Nuremberg trials. Despite such claims, there was never solid proof of any Jewish ancestry, but the idea persisted. Alois came from a poor peasant background, yet he worked hard to rise in status. He moved to Vienna and first tried his hand at shoemaking, but in 1855, he joined the Austrian civil service, working for the Royal Customs Office. Through diligence and ambition, Alois climbed the ranks, earning promotion after promotion. By 1876, while stationed in Braunau, he had achieved the title of Customs Inspector, the highest post available to someone with his education. He was proud of what he had accomplished. That same year, something significant happened. Alois's political uncle, Johann Nepomuk Hiedler, appeared before a lawyer and 3 witnesses and declared that Alois Schicklgruber was, in fact, the son of his deceased brother, Johann Georg Hiedler. Many historians believe Johann Nepomuk did this to ensure Alois could inherit property and gain a more respectable family name. The lawyer accepted the declaration, and soon after, the local priest in Döllersheim officially changed the baptismal record. The surname Schicklgruber was crossed out and replaced, not with Hiedler, but with Hitler. From then on, Alois went by the name Alois Hitler. Years later, Adolf Hitler would often say he was glad about this name change. He believed that Schicklgruber sounded awkward and would have limited his political career. Adolf Schicklgruber, he thought, would never have inspired a crowd the same way Adolf Hitler did. Alois married several times during his life. His second wife, Franziska Matzelsberger, whom he married in 1883, bore him 2 children, Alois Jr. and Angela. However, Franziska fell ill with tuberculosis. During her illness, a young woman named Clara Pelzel, Alois's cousin, came to help with the household chores. Clara was 23 years younger than Alois and called him uncle. Eventually, she became pregnant with his child. Alois didn't seem overly concerned about the situation, as Franziska's health was rapidly declining. When Franziska died, Alois quickly moved to marry Clara. However, because they were closely related, the Catholic Church initially refused to grant permission. It took months of paperwork and petitions before the church finally issued a special dispensation. The marriage took place early in the morning in January 1885 at 6 o'clock. After the ceremony, Alois went straight back to work. Their first son, Gustav, was born soon after, but died in infancy in 1887. Clara herself came from humble origins. She was born in 1860 in the rural village of Spital, about 35 kilometers from Döllersheim. Her parents were small farmers, and she grew up kind, gentle, and deeply religious. Very different from her strict husband, and later, her rebellious son Adolf. Even after marrying Alois, she continued to call him uncle, a small detail that showed how submissive she remained within the marriage. On April 20th, 1889, in the evening, Clara gave birth to a baby boy in Braunau am Inn, an Austrian border town by the river that separated Austria and Bavaria. It was unpleasantly cold Easter Saturday. The boy was named Adolf Hitler. His mother was 28 years old. His father, 51. From the very first page of Mein Kampf, Hitler later mentioned this location, calling it a sign of destiny, being born at the border between 2 states that, in his view, were meant to unite. When Adolf was 3 years old, the Hitler family moved to Passau, a German town just across the border. It was there that young Adolf picked up his distinctive Bavarian accent, which he carried for the rest of his life. Interestingly, this accent later helped him as a public speaker. Among Germans, the Bavarian tone was often heard as charming and folksy, something that made him sound more relatable when he spoke to the masses. As a child, Adolf was mischievous and full of energy. His favorite pastime was shooting with a toy pistol and hunting rats around the cemetery. He also loved playing soldiers with his friends. According to his own account in Mein Kampf, school came easy to him. Learning was, as he wrote, ridiculously simple, which meant he spent more time outside than at his desk. He earned high grades in nearly all his subjects and was considered one of the best students in class. By 1900, the Hitler family consisted of Alois and Clara, their 2 surviving children, Adolf and his younger sister Paula, and Adolf's half-sister Angela from Alois's earlier marriage. Angela's brother, Alois Jr., had already left home in 1895 at the age of 14 after a heated argument with their father. Tragedy struck the family multiple times. Before Adolf's birth, Clara had already lost 3 children. Then, in 1900, her 6-year-old son Edmund caught measles and died. Some have wondered what effect these losses had on Clara's relationship with Adolf. Did she become overprotective and tender? Or did she close herself off emotionally out of fear of losing another child? The psychoanalyst Erich Fromm once speculated that their relationship was cold, but this idea doesn't align with most historical accounts. Evidence suggests that Clara was a deeply loving mother, and Adolf was intensely attached to her. Even as an adult, he continued to speak about her with affection, and her death would later devastate him. During his school years, most of Hitler's teachers were German nationals who remained loyal to the Habsburg Emperor of Austria. In religious instruction, young Adolf was known for being outspoken. He once got into trouble for showing sympathy toward the German Empire, the Hohenzollerns, by organizing his pencils according to the colors of Greater Germany. His French teacher, a man named Hummer, later remembered him as a boy with clear talent, though not in every subject. He described him as strong-willed, irritable, and always convinced that he was right. Hummer also mentioned that Hitler was lazy and could have achieved much higher grades if he had put in more effort, given his natural intelligence. From these early accounts, a picture emerges of a boy who was bright and confident, but already stubborn and resistant to authority. Traits that would later grow into the defining characteristics of Adolf Hitler's personality. According to August Kubizek and other early acquaintances, Hitler possessed a notable talent for drawing. Yet, his performance in high school remained poor, though he was diligent as a kid. In 1900, he even had to repeat a school year due to his low grades. Later in life, Hitler would claim that his poor performance was deliberate, a form of rebellion against his father, who refused to support his artistic ambitions. However, a few historians think this explanation was one of many fabrications that shaped his self-image. That confrontation with his father ended abruptly on the morning of January 3, 1903, when Alois Hitler collapsed and died of a pulmonary hemorrhage after taking his first sip of wine in his favorite inn. For the 13-year-old Adolf, the death of his strict and domineering father likely came as a relief. Yet if his poor grades had truly been an act of protest, one might expect his academic record to improve afterward, but it did not. By 1904, his schoolwork remained substandard. He was eventually transferred to a Realschule in Steyr, about 40 kilometers away, where he boarded with an unfamiliar family. In 1905, he left school without completing his education, marking the beginning of years of uncertainty. By the end of 1909, Hitler's situation had deteriorated drastically. He was living in a homeless shelter in Vienna's Meidling district, surrounded by the poor, the unemployed, and alcoholics struggling to survive. These conditions, combined with his isolation and failure to get admission to the Academy of Fine Arts, may have fueled his growing bitterness and distrust of others. Vienna, a city of striking contrasts between wealth and poverty, must have seemed both vast and hostile to the young man. During his time in the shelter, Hitler befriended another vagrant named Reinhold Hanisch, who lived under the alias Fritz Walter. Hanisch later described Hitler as pale, hungry, and exhausted. He claimed that Hitler often slept outdoors, was frequently driven away by police, and that his feet were covered with sores from walking. His clothes were threadbare, discolored by rain and disinfectant, and he owned no coat to protect him from the cold. The two men searched for temporary work together. One winter, they earned small wages shoveling snow. Though Hitler's frail health made it hard for him to keep up, Hanisch and others often helped him secure small jobs. Hitler also carried luggage at Vienna's central station and spoke of his failed attempt to enter art school. Hanisch suggested that he could earn money by painting postcards and small cityscapes to sell on the streets. At first, Hitler hesitated, fearing police trouble and ashamed of his shabby clothes. but eventually he agreed and began painting again. Most of his early works were copies of other artists' pieces, painted in the reading room of a men's hostel. Despite his hardships, Hitler retained a rigid sense of pride and was often described as overly meticulous about his appearance whenever he could afford decent clothing. Hanusch also recalled Hitler's temper and intolerance for disagreement. On one occasion, during a discussion in the hostel, a worker entered the room with a red carnation in his buttonhole, a socialist symbol. Hitler leapt up, shouting that such a man should be thrown out and taught a lesson. Other residents soon began provoking him deliberately, amused by his fiery reactions. Yet at this stage, Hitler showed no particular hostility toward Jews. Hanusch claimed that Hitler even expressed admiration for Jewish culture and philanthropy, calling the idea of ritual murders nonsense. He had several Jewish acquaintances, including Siegfried Löffner and Josef Neumann, with whom he occasionally socialized. Biographers, such as Brigitte Hamann, have confirmed that Hitler's anti-Semitism had not yet formed during his Vienna years. His partnership with Hanusch ended abruptly in July 1910 after a dispute over money. From then on, Hitler sold his paintings directly to Jewish merchants such as Samuel Morgenstern, Landsberger, and Jakob Altenburg, whom he found fair and business-minded. By 1913, Hitler had moved to Munich, where he continued selling small paintings and postcards. His situation improved slightly as he gained a few steady clients, but his life remained unstable and isolated. Vienna had left a lasting mark on him. Those years of poverty, failure, and loneliness shaped much of his later outlook. The First World War soon followed, deepening his sense of destiny and resentment. After Germany's defeat in 1918, the revolution and the harsh Treaty of Versailles, widespread anger and despair created fertile ground for extremist ideas. When Hitler began speaking publicly, his rhetoric, driven by hatred and frustration, resonated deeply with those who felt betrayed. From these unlikely beginnings, the former vagrant of Vienna rose steadily through Bavaria's political circles. On January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler, once a homeless artist, was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The spark that would set Europe ablaze came on June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was assassinated in Sarajevo. Within weeks, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Alliances quickly pulled the continent into chaos. Germany mobilized its forces, invaded Luxembourg and Belgium, and began advancing toward France. Britain responded by declaring war on Germany, and soon the First World War engulfed Europe. At that time, Adolf Hitler was an Austrian living in Munich. Despite being a foreign citizen, he volunteered for the German army during the confusion of August 1914. His papers were overlooked, and he was accepted into the ranks. The Austrian authorities had been after him for dodging conscription, but Hitler had no interest in serving under the Habsburg Empire, which he despised. He wanted to fight for Germany, a nation he admired deeply. As war spread across the continent, Germany faced enemies on two fronts: Russia in the east, and Britain, France, and Belgium in the west. Hitler joined the army to support what he believed was the future of the German Empire. The coming years on the battlefield would change not only his own life, but the lives of millions around the world. Having failed as an Obendien artist, Hitler now found purpose in the army. Stationed on the Western Front, he served as a corporal and a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts and the front lines. Though not a frontline infantryman for most of the war, his job was still dangerous. He spent much of the conflict under fire from British and French artillery. In 1918, he was temporarily blinded in a gas attack. Reports from his fellow soldiers described him as disciplined and dutiful, though somewhat detached. He was eventually awarded the Iron Cross Second Class, and later the Iron Cross First Class, ironically, on the recommendation of a Jewish superior officer. Despite his bravery, He was never promoted beyond corporal, possibly because he lacked leadership qualities or failed to connect with his peers. Many who served with him recalled that Hitler was a loner, quiet, and distant. He had few friends and often kept to himself. Yet, in his later years, he would look back on his wartime service as the purest and most united time of his life. In his mind, the trenches of 1914 symbolized German brotherhood, a spirit he would one day try to recreate in the Third Reich. Meanwhile, the war raged on. Germany's early advances were checked by fierce resistance on both fronts. To the east, Russian forces suffered heavy defeats at the hands of German generals, but managed to crush Austria-Hungary's armies. In 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk forced Russia, now under Bolshevik control, to surrender vast territories. Germany gained the Baltic states and recognized the independence of Ukraine. For a brief moment, it appeared the tide had turned. The two-front war seemed over, and victory felt within reach. But that illusion did not last long. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, following Germany's campaign of unrestricted submarine warfare, which had sunk American ships, the balance shifted. American industry and manpower tipped the scales. Germany was soon overwhelmed by superior Allied forces. On November 11, 1918, the guns finally fell silent. Germany signed an armistice, ending the war. Yet for millions of Germans, the news came as a shock. Government propaganda had long insisted that victory was near. Suddenly, defeat had arrived without warning. When the details of the Treaty of Versailles emerged the following year, outrage swept across the country. The treaty placed full responsibility for the war on Germany under Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause. Germany was forced to cede territory, pay enormous reparations, and limit its army to just 100,000 men. It could no longer build combat ships or maintain an air force. To many Germans, this was not peace, it was humiliation. The sense of betrayal ran deep. Most believed they had agreed to an armistice, not a surrender. They saw themselves as victims of deceit by the Allies, particularly Britain and France, who had promised fair treatment through President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. Instead, the treaty stripped them of honor and security. In this atmosphere of bitterness, a dangerous myth began to spread: the stab in the back theory. According to this belief, Germany had not lost the war on the battlefield, but had been betrayed by traitors at home: socialists, communists, and especially Jews. While some Germans rejected the idea, it gained traction among right-wing extremists, desperate to make sense of the national collapse. For Adolf Hitler, the defeat was devastating. The war had given him identity, purpose, and belonging. Now, all of that was gone. Like many others, he could not accept that Germany had been beaten militarily. He embraced the stab-in-the-back myth, blaming Marxists and Jews for undermining the nation from within. The years following the war saw chaos in Germany: revolution, economic hardship, and political violence. But for Hitler, this turmoil also presented an opportunity. Out of resentment and ruin, he and others like him began searching for a new direction, a new cause to rally the nation. And from that search, a new political movement was about to emerge. One that would unite the bitter, the angry, and the broken under a single banner. It would become the seed of something far darker than the world had ever seen before. After the First World War, Adolf Hitler's world had collapsed. The empire he once believed in was gone. The streets were filled with unrest, and the Germany he had fought for was humiliated and broken. Yet beneath the surface of this political chaos, something deeper was forming inside his mind. A sickness that wasn't just political, but psychological. Hitler began to live inside a world of fear and obsession. He saw betrayal everywhere, weakness in everyone, and disease in everything that didn't fit into his idea of strength. His paranoia grew quietly, feeding on the humiliation of defeat and the misery of post-war Germany. He could not accept that Germany had lost because of its enemies abroad. For him, the rot had come from within, from invisible forces that had poisoned the nation. In Hitler's mind, the idea of illness and decay became something much larger than physical sickness. He often spoke of Germany as a living body, a body politic infected by corruption, greed, and impurity. And like a doctor with a deadly cure, he believed that the only way to heal the nation was to cut out the disease. That disease, in his imagination, became the Jew. For Hitler, Jews were not simply political opponents or a religious group. They were symbols of everything that made him feel weak, frightened, or unclean. In his speeches, he spoke of them as parasites, germs, and infections spreading through society. These were not metaphors to him. They were literal images born from his inner fears, the same fears that haunted his body and mind. He was obsessed with purity. He avoided alcohol, refused to smoke, and often complained about the dangers of contamination. Those who worked close to him noticed his strange routines, his obsession with hygiene, his strict diet, and his unpredictable health anxieties. Yet behind this surface of control was deep insecurity. He believed that strength could only survive by destroying what was impure. That belief soon turned into madness disguised as ideology. In Hitler's worldview, everything was about health and decay, purity and infection. He described Germany as a body attacked by invisible enemies: the Jew, the Marxist, the liberal, the weak. He was terrified of degeneration, of anything that could corrupt what he called the Aryan spirit. To him, Jews were not people. They were symptoms, the outward sign of a deeper illness. This way of thinking gave him comfort. It gave him a clear enemy, something to blame for all the pain and chaos around him. But it also reflected his own mind, a mind constantly at war with itself. He feared disease, but he was the one spreading it. He spoke of health, yet his hatred became the sickness that consumed him. Those who knew him closely described moments where his paranoia seemed uncontrollable. He would rant for hours about hidden plots, invisible networks, and the supposed corruption of society by Jewish influence. He believed newspapers, art, banking, and even medicine were part of a vast conspiracy designed to weaken the German people. To him, this wasn't a theory, it was reality. Every personal failure, every political setback, only confirmed his belief that the world was full of invisible enemies. It was the same pattern that had followed him since childhood. Rejection turned into anger, anger turned into control, and control turned into hatred. Now, that hatred was being dressed in political language and wrapped in the illusion of science. When Hitler spoke about the cleansing of the nation, he spoke like a man describing surgery. He used medical language to justify genocide. Jews were described as bacteria. Cities were said to be infected. His war wasn't just political, it was pathological. He saw himself as the doctor of a sick world, the only man strong enough to perform the painful operation that would save civilization. The idea of a healthy, pure society became his obsession. In his speeches and writings, he often claimed that nature itself demanded the destruction of the weak. He borrowed words from biology and twisted them into moral laws. This obsession wasn't born from logic. It came from deep psychological terror. He was terrified of his own weakness, his own failures, and his own mortality. In the mirror of his paranoia, the Jew became the reflection of everything he despised in himself. Even as he gained power, that fear never disappeared. It only grew. By the late 1930s, when he stood at the height of his authority, surrounded by soldiers, generals, and cheering crowds, his mind was more unstable than ever. He lived in a state of constant suspicion, convinced that enemies surrounded him on all sides. His staff often described how he would pace the floor for hours, talking to himself, whispering about betrayal and purity, life and death. To outsiders, Hitler seemed confident and commanding. But those who watched closely saw something else. A man trapped inside his own delusions. His health anxieties worsened. He trusted no one, not even his doctors. He demanded strict diets, strange medicines, and endless treatments to preserve his strength. Every headache, every tremor, every sleepless night became a sign of unseen danger. He was terrified of decay, both personal and national. As the war began, his paranoia reached its peak. He no longer saw people as individuals, but as threats. Entire populations were condemned as if they were germs to be wiped out. Every defeat on the battlefield deepened his conviction that the world was conspiring against him. He began isolating himself completely, surrounded only by those who reinforced his delusions. Inside his bunker, years later, that same paranoia ruled everything. He trusted no one, blamed everyone, and spoke endlessly about betrayal. The same fear that once drove him to cleanse the body of the nation now consumed his own. He became the embodiment of the sickness he had imagined, the decaying, trembling man who saw enemies in every shadow. Hitler's paranoia was more than a personal madness. It was the driving force behind his politics, his war, and his genocide. His fear of infection and weakness became the ideology of extermination. He imagined a world divided between health and disease, strength and rot, purity and contamination. And in trying to destroy the disease, he destroyed everything human in himself. In the end, his terror of corruption led to the ultimate corruption. A world reduced to ashes by the very man who feared decay the most. His paranoia didn't just consume him, it consumed an entire nation. By the time the war ended in 1945, Adolf Hitler had turned Europe into a graveyard. Under his orders and ideology, more than 6 million Jews were murdered, men, women, and children, in ghettos, camps, and mass executions across occupied Europe. Entire communities were wiped out, their names erased from maps, their voices brutally silenced forever. Beyond the lives lost, Jewish culture and property were systematically destroyed. Businesses, homes, and synagogues were looted or burned. Art collections and family heirlooms vanished into the hands of soldiers, officers, and officials of the Nazi regime. It is estimated that Jewish property worth over $3 billion at the time, equal to tens of billions today, was stolen or confiscated under state-sanctioned theft. What could not be taken was destroyed. The Holocaust shattered the centuries-old thread of Jewish life across Europe, apart from killing millions. Families were torn apart. Languages, traditions, and entire ways of living disappeared. For those who survived, survival itself became a lifelong struggle. To remember, to rebuild, and to live with memories that never faded. Hitler never saw the full aftermath of his own destruction. In the final days, hidden inside his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, he was still convinced he had done the right thing. To his last breath, he blamed Jews for the war, for Germany's downfall, and for every misery he could not face within himself. His mind remained trapped in the same delusion that had shaped his life. A belief that killing millions was a form of cleansing, a cure for a sickness that never existed. However, we just need to remember that his hatred did not begin with power. It began with fear. It grew from the soil of prejudice that had long existed in Europe, from the rejection he felt as a young man, from the humiliation of defeat, and from the paranoia that turned his insecurities into a mission. His life was proof of how hate, once nurtured, can evolve into something far greater than one man, a force capable of consuming nations. What began as a wounded boy's bitterness ended as humanity's darkest tragedy. Drop your thoughts about one of the most terrifying men in history in the comments below.